put your hands together and give a warm welcome to your host, Patrice Scanlon.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was such a nice welcome. Happy Hall of Fame 12. Here we are. I'm so excited about this panel. We're here to talk about 3D audio and Atmos. And I have three of the most amazing people on stage with me to talk about this subject and also talk about it in like three different facets of our industry, right? So representing the music side, we have Carlton Lynn. Representing game audio and Hall of Fame 12 inductee, Todia. And last, but certainly not least, representing the film side, we have Garry Rizzo. So I think like in the timeline, Atmos or immersive audio kind of hit film first, then we saw it kind of be introduced into games, and then finally music. So I was just wondering, when did you all get started working in immersive audio? Garry, you want to go first? You want to use
Is this working?
Yes,
I'm not
baby.
Sure. Oh, there it is. Okay. I started working in immersive sound for film probably as early as 2011. Being at Skywalker, we have a pretty close relationship with everybody at Dolby, and they came to us pretty early on and kind of introduced what they were thinking and the workflow that they envisioned for the future for film mixing and mastering. And we did some early conceptual tests. I remember we did, although we mixed the initial film for Tron Legacy was in 2010, we did an Atmos demo of that, kind of a proof of concept for them probably in 2011. And I know that we Skywalker, not me personally, did an upmix of the Pixar film Brave, was one of the first ones that actually got released in Atmos, but that was an upmix at the time. I think it was initially mixed in 7.1, and then they did, and it wasn't really an experiment at that point, it was a full-on execution, but the first film that was released domestic US that was mixed in native Atmos, meaning in that format as a premiere, was Joe Kosinski directed film called Oblivion, which Juan Peralta, another Hall of Fame member, and I, and Chris Boys, and well, there's a slew of Skywalker people that were involved, but we mixed that, and that was the first native Atmos release. So as early as 2011.
That's amazing. Love that. What about you, Tom?
Well, I got into immersive sound and 360 sound before I was actually doing it in games. So for me, it started with virtual reality. People think that that's automatically a game, but like virtual reality experiences and in 360 video. I got really fascinated with ambisonic audio, which is the origins, and it's decades old, of how 360 audio got going. It's essentially a microphone type where you can have 4, 8, 16 capsules in the mic, essentially placed in an array and going in all directions, and you're capturing a sphere or a soundscape, and then we take that essential ball of audio and represent it within virtual microphones, and it goes out to a binaural render, so you can listen to it directly in headphones without any speaker systems. And I was fascinated by that because that basically means anybody with just a regular pair of headphones and the system could experience it in a really simple way. And we've been doing something like Atmos in games for a long time, because Atmos is essentially an immersive tech for film. Some games use Atmos and we render out to it, but we've been using three-dimensional, meta-based audio and virtual speakers since even before Atmos was there. It's been around a while in games, but game consoles and CPUs weren't quite ready for it. It wasn't efficient to do it yet. So it came online about the same time that Atmos did. Atmos pulled a lot, as well as Oro 3D, which is another version of that, from games, and it's been kind of like back and forth learning exercises ever since.
Thank you. Carlton, what about you?
So I had been into trying to do an immersive mix for quite some time, but my first experience was fairly recently. So last year, I was mixing a project in stereo, of course, and finishing up. The A&R person was like, "Oh, so by the way, the lead song on the album we want to do in Atmos." And I'm like, "Great!" And I was like, "I'll do it. But I hadn't really done my homework. So over the course of a few days, I downloaded the renderer and just started trying to figure it out and using whatever resources I had online, figuring out, okay, how do I do this? So I set it up at home and using the binaural renderer, kind of set up a mix of okay, I think this is close. Then spend a day in the actual Atmos studio, and thank God I had support from Dolby Japan people. I was doing this in Japan. Had Dolby Japan people and the studio people to kind of help me get through, because it's a lot if you're going from stereo to all of a sudden Atmos, and trying to figure out just the renderer part of it. So I'm like, okay, just simple things like, how the hell do I bounce this down when I finish the mix? It's a lot to go through. So I kind of got dumped in the fire really quickly. So that was my first experience. So.
Beautiful. So what about your listening and mix environments? How has that changed for you guys? I think, Tom, you just recently helped EA build a room, right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I oversaw the money paying the experts to build
Oh,
it,
okay.
so I would say I helped sort of in a way.
That's helping.
Yeah, that's helping. It's a form of help, I guess. Yeah, we built all new facilities downtown for Tiburon, so we moved from Maitland to downtown, which is great, but it's been COVID, so none of us have actually been able to go into the building or work at all.
Oh, that's great.
We're supposed to go back in a few weeks. But we're doing 7.14 in our mix rooms, keeping it fairly simple. But we also do a lot of mixing in headphones because ultimately our output, we have people who play games in 714 or in other multi-channel outputs, but the majority of our audience is either listening directly on a TV or directly in earbuds or headphones. So I do a lot of my monitoring in headphones because most of what we do is going to end up coming out binaural to the audience as opposed to the multi-channel format. We render that down in real time into a binaural mix for the audience as opposed to too many speakers around.
Yeah, that's the part of this that I just love the most, is that we have these great environments to mix in with all these speakers, but then at the end of the day, most people are going to be listening on headphones.
Yeah, certainly on games, yeah.
Right?
That's the gift of cinema, really,
Right?
is that we have this environment that pre-pandemic, we would pack that house filled with people, and there was a spec to that room was calibrated to the white paper spec, and our mixes would play back as we mixed it. It was kind of a fixed environment, which is so helpful. I actually, for many years, was kind of frustrated, or imagined being frustrated as a music mixer, thinking how do you even make a stereo mix? You have to check it on 4 or 5 dozen different speakers to know how it's going to translate. And the gift of cinema is that there is a spec that everybody is supposed to be adhering to, so you know what the mix is supposed to play back. But the fact is, we make our mixes to play back for the premiere, where the director, producer, picture editor, everybody is. And if you hit that spec, well, we've done our job as best as we possibly can, versus we want this mix to play as great as it can on everything between earbuds and NS10s and HD1s, as well as cinema speakers. That strikes me as a very, daunting task. But, for us, it's having that white paper that we can adhere to is super helpful. I am curious how big that 714 room is that they built for games, though.
It's not that big because of space, so it's 20 by 18 feet.
Okay, that's a pretty big environment, though, for gaming.
Yeah. It's a large room, but it's nothing like a sound stage. It's massive.
So they can't monitor the same sound level that Garry would monitor.
Right. Well, our sound systems are built to have a lot of headroom for cinema.
You can't really in a small room. You can't really monitor that loud. So then.
Right. You got to bring it down.
No, but we try. We've got some big subs, and they bought us very expensive soundproof doors recently.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
The rest of the studio is jealous. They think we just sit around listening to music really loud while they're over at their computer cubicles making the game. And yeah.
But when they're making the game, you guys are listening binaural real-time render of what you're doing, but then you're listening to it also in a 714 environment. I'm curious how often you're listening to music mixes in a discrete 714 or 916 or whatever it is.
For me personally, not so often. So I'm doing a lot of my setup at home on headphones and binaural renderer. So I have surprises a lot. I go to the studio, I'm like, well, I'm kind of way off, so I have to quickly get it in line. And then I'm also surprised when actually sometimes, for example, here on Apple Spatial Audio, which is, not Dolby Atmos, they're doing a re-render. So we're hearing something different than what we actually mix. So there's a...
unless you have the Dolby Atmos workflow, coming out of like your Apple TV 4K, you can get the Atmos stream out of that.
Right, but like for spatial audio, what Apple's doing, they're doing one more re-render. So they're folding down like the overheads or something. They're doing a different
Well,
thing.
if you're going to listen to the 2-track from the Atmos stream, they're doing a render down. But in my home studio, I'm able to hear the broad Atmos mixes that the music mixers are delivering. I believe you have to deliver 2 separate tracks, the Atmos track as well as the 2-track mix.
Right.
And then I'm sure at the same time they're taking the Atmos mix and they're down mixing for those that are selected.
There has to be sample accurate,
sample accurate to length, the file length, and all that stuff. But
so that's another variable like that I had to go through the first time is like they kept saying, well, this is not the exact length of the two mix. I'm like, yes, it is. I did the 2 mix, but unbeknownst to me, the mastering engineer had trimmed the original 2 mix. So I'm like, well, so they were comparing the mastered to. So
and it's interesting because between film music and what we do, we never have a final mix. The final mix doesn't happen until someone plays it.
Until somebody plays the game.
So we're literally waiting for someone to play it to hear what the final mix is going to do. Yeah.
Right. Is that where beta testers come in, or the gamers that are playing it before release? Do you have that happening?
Oh, yeah. We have lots of beta testers, and we also have a QV team, that basically checks all of our work and tells us what we did wrong and why it's broken, and we should get better at what we're doing.
Yeah, I know those people.
They're geniuses, really. We could not make what we do without them because they find all sorts of problems that I didn't know I created need to be fixed. Yeah.
The essential QC pass for gaming. Yeah. Interesting.
So so there's everybody's trying to figure things out with this. Yeah,
True,
for sure. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, when you're mixing music for immersive, how much are you relying upon the LFE channel versus low end in the main channel?
Ooh,
Sorry, am I hijacking?
Yeah, I love this.
My first
going.
mix.
I mean, we're friends.
Yeah, we're friends.
My first mix, I tried using the LFE just a little bit, just kind of goosing it a little bit. And I added just a touch, and they were like, well, it's probably too much, so I don't even use it anymore. I don't use the LFE at all, because I was like, I'll let film guys mess with that.
Ah.
So I've been avoiding the LFE, because all of the spec is, most of the speakers should be full range, so I'm like, okay, I'm just giving full range to all the speakers, and I'm just avoiding the LFE because I just don't have enough experience with it.
Well, it's also the biggest wild card out in the world.
Exactly.
You never know how the consumer is going to have their subs set up. Again, there's a spec for the home, reproduction of this stuff, but who's adhering to that? It's one thing to say in cinema, there's an engineer that sets up a room or that checks a room, but it's another thing to say the consumer is now responsible for what level all those speakers are playing.
And then it goes back to the binaural render again. So that's absent. The LFE is absent from the binaural render, right? So when I'm just setting up a mix at home and headphones, that makes no sense for me to even play around with that. If I go to the studio, which changes for me because I don't have my own immersive room. I go to different studios, so their room should be to spec, but I'm like, I don't know this room, so I usually avoid the LFE.
I love it. So how has this technology changed your creative workflow?
Oh, it's changed it dramatically. For film, when you're working in multi-channel formats, meaning stereo, mono, stereo, LCR, 5.1, 7.1, everything is multi-channel based. And you can do things pretty quickly and efficiently. Certainly now with the evolution of the technology and Pro Tools and offline bouncing, you can do so much faster than you could. Once you introduce objects, Atmos objects, or it's not exclusive to Atmos, but once you introduce objects Do you guys know what objects are versus beds in Atmos? Do we need to cover that? No.
Why don't we do that?
Okay, so the idea for Dolby Atmos is that there are two kinds of audio tracks that you're running. You can have a bed channel or an object channel. The bed is designed inherently to be what they would call a 712, 7 being LCR, your traditional left, center, right, discrete speaker channels. Left side surround, right side surround, left rear surround, right rear surround. And the 0.1 is your LFE channel that we were talking about earlier. We probably did this a little out of order. That's okay. I'll forgive myself. And then the 712, the 2 refers to the ceiling channels. So in the theatrical formats, you have an array of speakers, depending upon how big your room is, that you may have 4 or 5 speakers on the ceiling that within the bed, that ceiling channel on the left side and right side they are 2 channels. So it uses the entire array versus an object, which is a mono channel that does not have the panning data baked into it like the bed does. It sounds a little confusing. I'll try to make a quick example of this, where if you have a car panning as it goes across the screen from left to right, you take your panner and you pan it from left to right in sync with the image, and that is mixed and is rendered, basically, for lack of a better term, into that LCR. If it were not put into the bed, if it were a mono object, you would have the car engine on a mono track, and with that mono track would be metadata, what we would consider XYZ panning data. The x-axis being left to right, the y-axis being front to back, and the z-axis being height. So that car would have panning data on the x-axis going from left to right. But it's a mono channel. If you had 5 or 6 speakers in the front of your room, it would utilize all those channels because it has the metadata. It's not embedded directly to the LCR. I think that's as quick as I can explain it.
An amazing.
That's a good explanation.
That was pretty good.
I don't know if I could get it any more concise. So that said, like once you introduce objects into your mix, it's awesome because if you've got 64 surround channels in your cinema, and I like to use the mosquito example, you can have that mosquito fly through every surround channel if you've got a room big enough for it. The smaller your room is, if you have 4 surround speakers, it will utilize all 4. If you only have 1, it'll use that 1. You won't get the full resolution of panning. The whole idea is that it's adaptive to the size of the room. And that's really cool. If you've got a huge room, you know, the Chinese Chinese theater on Hollywood Boulevard, huge room. You can utilize that. You can really hear how discreet that panning actually is. It's magnificent. The problem, it's hardly a problem, it's something we have to deal with. It's for the down mixes, in that when you do make a 7:1 render or a 5:1 render or a stereo render binaurally, you have to integrate that into your down mix workflow. And it gets, it's a little bit more time consuming to do it. It's a real-time process currently, although I want to believe that's going to change going forward, but we'll get there. Yeah, objects. They're cool, but it definitely makes the workflow a little bit more specified. You got to take the time to make sure it's being done right. That's the other thing, QC, to do it.
And then one other thing about objects, so in the music world, a lot of times we're using like master faders, right? So the only thing that's going through the master fader is those bed channels, right? So your objects don't necessarily, if you're using any kind of limiter and compressor, so your objects not necessarily go through that. So that's another thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing in games.
Yeah.
Yeah, our objects, which is almost all objects, is what we do these days. But our objects bypass our master patch, which is like the master section of the console, and go directly to the outputs. So when you're in that environment, you have to double up processing or get really efficient with routing, because everything we do in a game is real time. So I can make some really amazing stuff on a $10,000 computer that's fascinating, but then half of my audience will never be able to hear it that way. Right. So unlike a fixed environment, we have to, you know, somehow meet in the middle between what we can do and what we know people can actually experience at home.
Right.
But the nice thing about the XYZ data for gaming, if everything is an object, which is really awesome, if you have that environment, whether it's a binaural re-render or whether it's a full-blown 916 Atmos installation, is that when that critter is running around, you're going to get that full resolution.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and if it's in binaural, the trick, which a lot of our stuff is in binaural, the trick is making the filtering process still sound really good, because we have to deal with HRTF, filters, and we don't have an infinite number of them, and everybody wants a custom one, but it's not really possible right now to do that efficiently, and so there's a lot of quality concerns on the binaural output right now. There's some great ways to fix it, but again, the processing, your CPU just will catch on fire if we opened it up all the way.
Can you talk a little bit about the HRTF?
Yeah, so HRTF is head-related transfer function. It's basically, in its simplest terms, it's a way of capturing the size and shape of your own ear. So the way that we all hear in the real world, the way we hear distance and everything else, is a combination of signals, reflections that get to one ear and the other ear differently, essentially. So your brain knows exactly where an object is in space around you because of the difference between the ears. Completely different from stereo. That's not what stereo is. Stereo is two channels, left and right, and you can move within it, but essentially it's a fixed image. Binaural and HRTF are a little different. So what happens is MIT started doing this a very long time ago. This is not new tech, it's just still being improved. There are libraries of people's heads that have been recorded, and you can actually find a lot of them and look at the pictures of the ears they used to record at the time and try to find ears that look like yours, and hopefully that will sound similar to what you're doing. And essentially, if you think about these objects we're talking about in the game spinning around you, the difference between the object being here and then suddenly being here runs through this HRTF process, and it filters it out and decides how much you're going to hear in one ear versus the other. And when it's done right, it actually sounds like there's space around you in headphones. Like something is really 10 feet away, and the reflection of that sound hitting this virtual back wall and getting back to this ear really immerses you into the space if it's done right. One of the problems, though, is creating the fake room around the HRTF, because it all deals with reflections. If you do object-based sound in a space that has no reflections of any kind, it sounds more like simple panning. It doesn't really do much. But if you can hear the actual delay and decay of the virtual space you set up, well, now that object is here, but the reflections of it and the way it's moving around the room and coming to both ears can actually sound like a real physical space. And that's where we're headed. And again, we can do it now in a scientific way, but if we push the processing on that too much at the moment, it's just even the newest consoles can't really handle it, because the rest of the game needs some of that power too. If it was just audio, which it should be,
right.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
Why are all these visuals in the game?
Slowing down my audio speed. Yeah.
So it's like one of those things where we have the technology, but maybe on the consumer side, we're still kind of waiting for these products to be developed a little bit better, and maybe at a better price point so more people can get involved.
Yeah, and it's a rabbit hole.
Totally.
100 years from now, it's going to be the same thing. There'll be audio producers and artists knowing what their capability is, but knowing the audience isn't quite there yet. So that's not new right now. It's always going to be that way.
Right.
And anyone that gets into the science of audio, you're always going to be thinking about the next thing that you can do and invent, and how you can somehow get that to the audience in a way that makes sense and works for them.
Well, if I may, I'd love to just see a quick show of hands. How many people have the AirPod Pros or the latest version of the AirPods? And how many of you listen to immersive music over Apple Music or even listen to Atmos? Do you listen to Atmos like movie soundtracks as well? Not as much as music? Okay, so it's getting there.
Yeah, I mean that was almost,
there.
I would say almost close to half. Maybe 30%, 40%. But yeah, a lot more than I actually thought, I
think that's an indication, though. I mean, I like that.
All right. So let's see here. So you were talking about how you had one project that was created for more of the 5.1, 7.1 surround sound system, and then changing that to fit into the Atmos. Right.
Yeah,
so
an upmix. Yeah, a film that starts in one format.
Right.
Was completed in one format, and then ultimately wants to kind of enhance it.
Right. So what was the difference between that process and then starting a new project where that's going to be the delivery is the Atmos system? How did that change the creative workflow?
One that I did in that in that workflow was the Blu-ray release of The Incredibles that we did, which was, I think, a couple of years after the initial theatrical mix that we did. Incredibles was done, what year was it? 2004, I believe it was. And we mixed that when Dolby Surround EX was still a thing. We didn't even have a 7.1 at that point. EX was... What was EX exactly? I'll tell you. EX... What they did, they were trying, Dolby were trying to give us another channel of audio before 7.1 was really ready. So what they did was they matrix encoded the left surround, right surround to create a center. For years, we, way back when VHS and Super VHS, the only way to get surround sound was that they encoded a matrixed version of the sound mix into 2 channels. So any information that was exclusively in the left channel would go to the left speaker, exclusively in the right channel would go to the right speaker. Common in-phase information went to the center, and common out-of-phase information went to a mono surround channel. That was the fundamental matrix of how Dolby, the initial version of Dolby Surround worked. Well, then we had 5.1, which gave us discrete channels, one of which was an LFE channel, but what Dolby did next was EX. So they took the left surround, right surround discrete channels, and they would matrix encode those two so you could derive a surround center channel. Okay. And so then you kind of had quasi 6.1, but it wasn't a discrete version because it was a matrix encode of the left surround, right surround. Really, it was merely a bridge of a format to get us to 7.1. 7.1 is truly for discrete surround channels. So Incredibles was done initially in EX as a native mix format, and then a couple years later, we did an Atmos up mix specifically for the Blu-ray release. And we would kind of go back and dissect, surgically remove certain elements that we wanted to create objects out of or spread out a little bit more, and remove it from essentially the bed and make it an object, and then rewrite panning data, X, Y, Z, so that things could go through the ceiling. It really is, it's a bit surgical because you want to be honest to the track as to what it was. Me, myself, I'm a nostalgic spirit, so I like to be very honest or I try to be as honest as I can to what the original mix was, while of course, giving the upmix that we were after. So we're very specific and very cautious and very careful in terms of let's make sure that the mix remains in its original integrity while bringing it up to Atmos spec. So surgical, careful. I don't really like doing that kind of thing because it is a derivative of the original release, which is what it was. But it's a bit more surgical than just doing a native Atmos mix. Native Atmos, it's kind of like you're off the leash. You can run. You can do whatever it is that you want to try doing in order to create the ideal initial premiere version of the mix. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. So what are you receiving, like STEM-wise? Do you feel like things have been separated out more so you have more control in the mix?
No, I think things are still being delivered as separate as they ever were. The scope of the mixes has grown over the years. As much as the technology has grown, the expectation has grown with it, as is the initial build. As the years go on and we have this technology that's growing, we can build tracks that are much more detailed, and the track count can get much wider. We don't even talk about track count anymore. There was a day when I started mixing where it was like, we've got a mix that used 500 tracks of source audio. Wow. Now it's like 500. That's my dialogue premix. That's not even the sound effects. Sound effects are thousands of tracks. Wow. We just stopped counting. I forget what year we stopped counting too. The number is just too big and too silly to throw around at that point. The fact is that it's getting more and more detailed, which is amazing that we have that ability to do it.
It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, but in terms of the splits that were given, like the splits were always there. We were just mixing it into a different format.
Got you.
Whether it was 5.1 or 7.1 and now Atmos. But I do like having certainly with the music, you got to remember for theatrical music, we have a scoring mixer that's involved before you get to the music editor, and then the music editor hands it off to the re-recording mixer. So maintaining that spread and that split allows us a lot more latitude within the Atmos platform. I certainly like spreading things out, spreading out the choir, spreading out the strings sometimes, and I'll spread them all out a little bit differently. I personally like using what I'll call the proscenium channels, meaning the speakers that are still in front of the audience but outside of the screen image. They would call that a 916, 9 channels on the floor, meaning left, center, right. You got your left side, left back, right back, but also a wide set of left, right channels just outside of the image. To me, that is a blessing to have those channels, and I'm curious how much the music crews are using them.
I haven't used them, but I've read articles like there's a lot of music mixers that they do like having those super wide.
Super wide, yeah, because it's still stereo but wider.
Yeah.
You know, it's certainly for film to be able to spread that out, even within the context of just music. For example, taking that choir and spreading that choir wider. I'll actually use the height channels as well for like the initial LCR image of a choir. You know, maybe leave the piano on screen in the LCR, but pull the choir out just to give you another layer of dimension.
As a matter of fact, Josh, who was supposed to be here today, I think his room, he did a 916 room, did he not?
Yeah, I talked him into it.
So he's got the super wide guys, yeah.
Yeah. And theatrically, it's like you may have 10 speakers along your left wall and right wall. So to just use the proscenium channel really gives almost a very focused sense of specificity to the mix. And one speaker doing one job versus one speaker doing covering 2 instruments or 3 instruments or 4 instruments. If you can use one channel discreetly for one element, I find that certain things can pop out of the mix if you really want them to. So I'll always encourage the use of those prosceniums. Sometimes overly focused objects are not good. It just draws your attention to it so much, but that's why I like those prosceniums, because they are still in front of you. Yeah. It is still just a widening of the stereo image. For years we've been using some plug-in trickery to try and widen the sound of our mix more and more. Yeah. Well, now you have discrete speakers.
Yeah. Which makes things a lot easier. You have space to place things, yeah. Exactly.
And headroom.
Exactly.
I gotta say, I'll encourage everybody to check out the 2019 Atmos mix of Abbey Road for so many reasons. That box set is pretty great. The Atmos mix that's on it is wonderful. Specifically, though, for this comment, is their use of the headroom. Right. If you have a system that has 20 decibels of headroom, if you listen to the She's So Heavy, that track starts off right where you think it should, and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows and it gets huge. Just when you think you have to turn the volume down, it stops. Like, there's a wonderful use of the headroom to get an emotional reaction out of you. Right. You experience that song that you've heard a million times in a way that you haven't felt it before. That, to me, is the blessing.
Yeah, that's the kind of great thing about immersive audio. It's like we've almost come full circle. We went through the whole volume wars with stereo mixes for, 15 years or more now. Now, with immersive mixes, you kind of have to leave some headroom. So you're encouraged to have some more dynamics, and it's great. So you're having some great mixes with actual, dynamics and purvey some emotion. So that's another thing great about it.
Oh, I love dynamics.
He said the loudness wars.
Yeah.
Yes. They're still being fought.
Right. So, yeah, that was one thing with Josh I really wanted to hit on with him being here on this panel, because I know a big reason he built that room was because he was asked to take the entire library of Justin Bieber and remix that in Atmos. So, Carlton and I were talking about this yesterday. He was lucky enough to start working from the start of the project in this format. But I just wonder how much of a challenge that would be going back from like the archive delivered stems. Maybe you had like a whole drum stem, but now you want the snare and the hat to be separated,
Yeah, I think it probably depends. Like Josh probably mixed, he probably mixed most of the catalog, with Justin's catalog, a lot of it anyway.
So he probably had all the, even the multi-tracks, right?
Then it just depends on the stems and whoever printed the original stems, So sometimes if they printed it with, verbs and delays all baked into like a stereo drum mix or whatever, or then you're kind of limited to that unless you can get them to go back and reprint and separate out the verbs and stuff. So it just depends on what you're given,
Right.
But Josh, he might have been able to go back to his original sessions and whatever and print whatever he needed.
And this is interesting because this is something we do not deal with at all in games.
Right.
Nothing is ever mixed. Everything is always in its original state. Right now, the current title I'm working on, we've got 100,000 lines of interactive dialogue. We've got tens of thousands of assets, crowds, and it all remains in its original format. There's no stems, there's no mixes. All of that is done in real time. So we have access to all of it, but it also becomes completely overwhelming. And you have to do the whole thing and time box it in stages, because if you actually thought of a game in the way that you might do a linear project where like we have a mix time, now we're going to mix it, it would take forever. You just couldn't do it. So we have to like mix and design every day as we go. And then there is a final mix, and there is a period of time where we balance everything out into the mix. But if it got closer to the end when we really picked that up, we'd be doomed. Yeah, it would just take way too long.
And a lot of where that placement is happening is built into either like using Wise or in the game engine itself, or
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we have our own proprietary stuff, so we're not using Wise or anything.
Right.
It's very similar to what Wise kind of does. The great thing about a tool like Wise is it really makes things accessible to an audio artist that doesn't do scripting or programming. Because it's an interface, it's like a DAW, it makes sense. You've got play buttons, you've got things that are easy to understand and look at if you're an audio person. You guys could pick it up in no time because it's really just like a unique tool. The problem is software engineers on our team do not like that, because essentially when you use a tool like that, you're taking all the things that they constantly work on and massage and putting it behind somewhat of a gate that they can't really touch and control. And software engineers lose their mind about that. So I actually tried to get our company to use Wise because it's something that I knew really well. And they're like, absolutely not. We're not doing that. Everything is raw code and we're doing it from scratch. But that's why we couldn't do what we do without our type of audio artist that I run a team of, but also a tech artist, which is someone who does a lot of scripting and library building and API building, and then also software engineers who know pure C++ and foundational code. And between the three stages, that's how we're able to basically get across the finish line.
Wonderful. So do you guys have a separate room where you have a lot of the consumer playback systems so you guys can check it, or are we just kind of like winging it and hope the Atmos fold down is going to do its job when it goes to those other consumer-based playback systems?
I'm definitely going to do what Garry is talking about with your whole Apple 4K thing where
Oh yeah.
I got to check that out. But so I was telling Patrice the other day, so the studios I go to in Japan, so it's cool. They have, the room where we're mixing at, then they also have a lounge with it's basically like your living room at home. And they have like multiple, they have, a Sony Atmos soundbar. They have like the Amazon Alexa thing. And then like a little, actually just, discrete speakers and everything. So they have many consumer things all around the room. So you can bring your thumb drive in and plug in your mix and check it out on different formats or different home devices. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, and we use a combination of things at our studio. So we've got our rooms with our multi-channel discrete high-end sound systems, and then we've got multiple stereo versions all the way down to these little $18 plastic Amazon speakers I bought. They go down to that, and we use headphones. I've got like $4,000 ultrasonic headphones down to like $50 headphones, and then we do earbuds, and then we have on one of our floors what is essentially like a dub stage without a console, just for theater seating and sitting there and listen as if someone had a giant home theater. But at the end of the day, there's so much in a game mix to do that I couldn't, even if we go into the big listening room and a producer says they would like to hear something slightly different because of that, there's so many environments to listen to. It's more of a note where let's say, sure, we'll work on that soon. But there's just no time to go and deal with the mix in that sort of inaccurate way. And there's too much going on. We don't know what's going to happen. At any moment, you could hear one or two sounds. Someone else playing the game that gets to that exact same scene could be in a scenario where there's an overwhelming amount of audio assets and dynamic range getting hit really, really fast. So, a lot of what we have to do is take it with a grain of salt and try to keep the mix from getting too cluttered. But a lot of times I'll go home and play a game I've worked on and realize I never heard that scenario in the 3 years I worked on it. I just heard it right now at home. And
That's what I love about nonlinear. You know, it's just like you can try to prepare for almost every situation that maybe the game player is going to go into, but then it's so amazing. These people just find this path that you never even thought of, and you're like, oops,
well, and the
that's
worst
not
for us
working.
is you spend so much time and energy and you put your heart and soul into this mix, and it's so developed and it takes so much time and you're so proud of it. But then in our case, we give the audience all of these virtual faders in the front end where they just go in, I'm just going to turn the commentary off and let me bring the sound effects volume down. And I prefer it like that. I'm like, oh my God.
No,
what are
don't
you
do it.
doing? Wrong. I almost want to make those sliders not do anything so they can play with it and believe they're doing something.
The producer fader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right, yeah, that must be really frustrating.
Well,
No, seriously.
yeah.
Like that's like I wouldn't want somebody going into my mixes and being able to say, "Yeah, I'm gonna turn all the drums down."
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
wait, what?
And it's a reality of gaming because there are some people get really, really competitive about gaming. How many people in here play games besides me? I'm the only one. Okay, so we got a bunch of people play
More
games.
than half AirPods.
People play games and they need to hear things differently. If you're playing a shooter game or an online or some kind of a competitive game, certain things are going to obstruct your ability to hear the cues you need to be able to fight back appropriately. And so people go in and tweak it. And as much as that's frustrating to an audio mixer because you don't want them to touch that, it's such an important part of our experience that you have to give them as much control as they need to really enjoy the game, or else you're just cutting them out of the mix because they enjoy it in a different way. As long as they don't review bomb us and buy it, I'm happy. You know.
Well, are you assigning like priorities then? Like within, if there's possibly 5 or 6 sounds that need to play at once, are you saying, okay, well, this one has the highest priority no matter what is happening in the game?
Oh,
this
yeah.
one has to come out.
I live in a world of priorities, and more importantly, a world of priorities that change based on given contextual scenes.
Right,
So
right.
I spend a lot of time on sports games now. We're making our college football game again, and the priority level to that is we want to hear the commentary, but we're at the most aggressive moment of the crowd going insane. We don't need to hear the commentary right now, and that priority will change based on incoming context. What time of day is it? Do these teams consider each other's rivals? And is it like an old tradition, or do they not care about each other? There's literally a million things that we
Wow.
check in
Yeah.
terms of data that not only do we have the priority, but the priorities of all of that changes based on the contextual situations of the data.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas within narrative filmmaking, we are being guided through the narrative track of that, through the mix choices that we're making, where we're saying we are deciding what has the priority and we're baking that decision into the mix,
Right.
essentially.
And we'll set up, I might have 20 priorities on a scenario, but depending on what you're doing at the moment when you're playing it, those priorities will shift like
Right.
a Rubik's Cube, and then priorities shift as well.
Right. All eating data bandwidth, of course.
That's what I was
Yeah.
going to say is like all depending on consoles, CPU, and everything, right? All that.
Yeah, but you know what? Our commentary team has made this system at EA that basically is a giant Excel database. And it's crazy because of how efficient it is. And it's constantly checking for data. So the data is looking every frame, 30 frames a second minimum. So it's checking data all the time. And it says, oh, it's 8 p.m. right now. And the person doing the commentary is talking. The enemy, the home team is up by 14. The game is almost over. So we're constantly running all that data. And then our context system will put together sentences that decide which chunks of a sentence to play. Because if we had in a game, if we had to say, you know, Aaron Rodgers goes for the long throw and record a version of everything that could happen, it'd be millions and millions of lines. So it might
Right.
be Aaron Rodgers with a long S tail. We call it an S stitch. And then on the other side, we'll have a million versions of receives, you know, whatever it is, and in real time, those sentences have to stitch together to make it sound seamless. And we're bringing in individual words, and we actually have to I'll take S's, cut the S in half, get rid of the S, and get the sibilants coming in and out of the S, and then paste that in reverse to 2 different sentences so that when they're pasted together, it sounds like it's flowing right through them.
Right. Yeah, because otherwise it could sound like really robotic and
Yeah, that look on your face is appropriate. Yeah, that's exactly what
So that's real-time AI dialogue editing is what you're talking about.
Basically, and what's great is it's essentially, if you've ever used Excel, it's a bunch of Excel macros, just checking data and deciding what should go together and when. And it's probably the most efficient tool I've ever seen because somebody figured out how to do it without a big software program or library, just checking lines of Excel. And if it's true, play these things together and then get rid of them out of the audio stream.
Yeah, it makes us who work in linear
That's
feel
impressive. That's really
blessed.
impressive.
Yeah, I don't want to make it seem like I do all of that myself. You're
You
talking about
do,
like a
you
team
do.
of 20 people making all of that happen. They just make it sound good at the end. So somewhere there's a genius software engineer making it so, and then we get to talk about it like I did it.
Good job.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, y'all, we're gonna pass it over to you guys. Hopefully you guys have some great questions. So we've got a mic over here. So a couple of people queue up there. We've also got a mic on this side. So what we'll do is have a question from here, question from here, question from online. Yeah? Let's do it.
Do we get to see the online?
No, we don't, sorry.
Okay. Hey, my question's for Carlton. I understand how Atmos can be applicable in games and film, obviously, because there's elements which go above, say, a ball or something, or like a bullet which can go from several angles, or say a dragon which goes above you. But how does that translate into music? Because I mean, for me, okay, it's a very basic question, but for me, it's like everything's stereo. You have drums here, and you have like left and right overheads and stuff like that. How do you do something where you're like in a 3D space, so to speak, with music? How do you mix for a 3D space? Like, where do your elements go?
I mean, it's total creative thing. So it depends on what you're working on and if it's a legacy type thing. So, for example, if you're doing legacy stuff like Universal Music, they send out this PDF to all of the mixers that are doing legacy stuff, and they're basically kind of telling you, don't go nuts. They're saying, okay, we want you to do a immersive mix, but don't reinvent the mix. You know what I mean? So it just depends. But if you're doing something new, like for example, on a project where I was already doing the stereo mix, then I can kind of get a little more adventurous with it, and yeah, you can put the vocal in the back if you want to, but it's going to be, for example, in spatial audio, you can, Apple Spatial Audio, you can flip back and forth between the Atmos mix and stereo. It'll be a little bit jarring, though. So if you have a stereo mix with the vocal in the middle, and you flip back to to Atmos, it's going to be in the back. So, you can kind of do what you want, and you got overhead speakers behind you, so you can totally do any kind of 3D thing that you want. So there's not really any rules, but you also are always comparing the stereo mix, at least now. So you don't want to kind of jar the listener too much. So yeah.
It's kind of like when we went from mono to stereo, and people would put the whole drum kit in the left channel, and then maybe the lead vocal in the right channel,
Right,
and
dual mono.
right, or and it's just like, okay, well, we got this new format, but like, let's not make it gimmicky, or weird. That's a hard creative choice, right? To be able to utilize that without it sounding, I don't know, forced, I guess.
It is. I mix a number of musical films. Sing 2, we just finished up this year, that are obviously very music heavy, where the material is not brought in native Atmos, and the goal is to put it in the cinema experience in Atmos. The soundtrack mixes get done separately from that. They don't lift the mixes out of my Atmos mix and put them on an Atmos soundtrack release. But to answer the question, we use a variety of concepts and ideas to kind of fill the space. Sometimes it's little delays, little reverbs, little things that you can add that, of course, are respectful to the initial intention of the track. And other times we're using some up mixers. Nugen Halo is one of them. Penio Pro is another one that will actually take a stereo or a mono and up mix. And sometimes you utilize a little bit of that. Sometimes I'll just use whatever fill it creates from the ceiling to fill the drums or something. But I find that there's no one answer for anything. You wind up treating the guitar separately from the drums, separate from the keyboards, certainly separate from the vocals. Your vocals are always kind of attached to your character. Many methods to upmixing, essentially.
And I would imagine it has a lot to do with the content too.
Yeah.
If we're working with an orchestral score, that's going to be different than like a dead mouse track. If you mix
Sure.
There's all sorts of leeway to do things there. It depends on the source.
Sure. And if you have an orchestra, or an orchestrated track, you want to believe that you've got access to the room mics in a way that maybe you traditionally wouldn't be given. So you might have the Decatree separate from distant mics, separate from spot mics, and be able to create your own hemisphere of the scoring stage, that's the experience we're trying to communicate through these immersive mixes.
That's beautiful. How about over here? Hello.
Hello?
There we go.
Okay, there you go. A question for all of you. What would your advice be for like a guy who kind of lives in a bedroom and wants to like get into 3D audio? What would your advice be?
I can start that one. There are a lot of tools that will actually let you build and render out three-dimensional audio into a binaural engine that are completely free. That's how I started learning how to do it. And you don't need multi-channel speakers to do it. You're not going to hear the discrete mix in that way, and the binaural is never going to sound exactly the same way, at least not in this era right now. But yeah, there's multiple tools you can use for that. If you are interested in the sound design-y sort of side of it, you could get tools like Unreal Engine, Wise, Fmod. They have binaural engines in there that are free. You can run a multi-channel mix through them. You can hear things panning up and above and around you. So there's really actually there's a good amount of free content out there to do that with. You can go online and download free HRTF filters, put them into the tool yourself, listen to them. One of the best things to do if you're learning that from the ground up in the beginning is to start really subtle and just listen to what's actually happening. So a single looping sound that you know the tone of, and you move it around and you create a new sense of space, within that 3D environment, and you hear the reality of what it sounds like. Because the surround sound portion of what we do, and I'm sure it's the same in movies, is one thing. Once you get into the height and the depth above and below you, that's when things tend to get tricky in binaural, because it kind of works on what's like a curve. It never sounds like it's going directly up. It's like it's kind of fading this way off into the distance. And there's only so much you can do with it. You can't make it infinitely sound like it's a mile over that way. But if you get those free tools and just start doing the basics and learning what it sounds like as you move around the parameters, your mind is going to start coming up quickly with things that will and won't work over time. The worst is if you jump into a giant project and try to mix probably a song or a movie or a game. It'll be so overwhelming. It'll be like, this is not worth doing it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I like to record my own voice. Not that I like listening to myself, but you know what it sounds like. And then make that move around the space. And the next time you're working on a guitar track or something, you'll remember what that sounded like and what didn't work well.
That is great advice. And also the latest version of Logic allows you to work in Atmos. So maybe getting that if you're more...
Cubase, I think, has its own renderer and everything in it
Okay.
as well. I think.
Well, they get Logic and Pro Tools in their launch box, so let's keep it free,
I'll encourage you to listen a lot, though, and read a lot, and try to get a mentor. Like, try to spend some time working with somebody or for somebody that's doing it so that you can actually witness successes and creative failures, too, because they happen. So, listen, be aware, be present. The fundamentals, really. The fundamentals will take you the distance. They really will.
Exactly. So what about a question from online?
Yep. So our first question we got from online is from Ritvik Shah. They're joining us online this morning via YouTube chat. They are a recording arts graduate, and their questions for the panel. How do you go about referencing your mixes for Apple Spatial, since there's no way to effectively audition it until it's out on Apple Music?
Carlton and I were just talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, just go to Apple Music and check it now.
Yeah.
So I think what Garry was talking about earlier, just setting up the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I did something that I can't necessarily suggest everybody do, but being the movie fan that I am, I've always been a home theater enthusiast. So I've always been trying to. I was one of the first people to have 5.1 surround sound, and it's something that I share with my children. It's a family thing when we do family movie night, and I've got a nice big setup with video projection, and it's not $1 million room, but it's bigger than the average setup. And I've also set it up to be a functional home studio as well. So that's kind of how I'm checking how my mixes for near-field versions, because we still do near-field versions of our mixes. I'll bring them into my home studio. I've got Pro Tools in there, and it integrates in with the consumer processor that I have as well. And my room is EQ'd to spec. It's bigger than the average consumer setup, but that's cool. And I listen to it there because I know that this will give me a real representation of what the master track that I'm delivering sounds like. And that's how I check it. And then I'll also have the earbuds, and I got the headphones, and I listen to down mixes like that. Like, I know it's a little bit different than most people. It may be more elaborate than most people, but I feel like I'm delivering a solid track that's been checked in as many formats as I can possibly check it.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, that the whole spatial audio thing, because of my first mix I did, and I heard it for the first time on spatial audio, and I was like, whoa. I was like, it's not what it sounded like in the studio. And I was like, it sounds like a bad karaoke mix. Like, I was like, what is going on? You know, it just kind of freaked me out. But so it's tricky. It's tricky. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully Apple Music will find a workaround for that. You know, it's just not there right now. I was watching something on LinkedIn Learning, and the guy was saying, yeah, just like distribute your track and listen to it on Apple Music. I'm like, why would you want to distribute something that isn't a finished product, you know, just to test it and see how it's going to sound in that format?
I think the best thing is what Gary said, just try it out on a bunch of different formats, and, you know, just by process of, you know, averaging it out, you know,
I hope for
works
the
on
best.
the Amazon, like, you know, Amazon device, a sound bar. It should hopefully sound decent.
I will say there are some great sounding tracks that are out there on Apple Music.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I mentioned Abbey Road earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a couple of Skrillex tracks that sound amazing. Rocket Man is always my like reference. The Atmos mix of Rocket Man is delicious in every way there is to be delicious. Yeah, I mean, that to me, if I ever want to reference like whatever I'm listening to, all right, put on Rocket Man and check that. Okay, I can do better. I go back to my, you know, and I work on my mix to try and make it better, and then I go back to Rocket Man, and I still shake my head. That's just the best track ever in Atmos. It sounds so good. I highly suggest y'all give it a listen if you're into immersive music.
There's some really cool ones out there. There's some bad ones out there too.
There are. Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, for every
Those are
good
important
one.
to listen to also.
They are.
Yeah.
They totally are. That's part of what I meant to answer the question of listen a lot. Listen to the good tracks and listen to the bad ones. And there are some bad ones that sometimes they take a 2-track and they just put it through Penio and that's it. And they just deliver. They say, yep, it's got something in the ceiling.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like washy madness.
Call it a day, right?
Yeah, that's it. Call it a day. You're done. You know, don't do much. Okay, this is me not doing much. You know, you run it through one plugin. That's to me, that's not an immersive mix. That's just a shortcut. There are no shortcuts.
Yeah.
That is unfortunately our time.
Aww. Yeah, I feel like we could have split this into like 3 different panels.
Yeah, I even
right?
had questions.
Yeah. I have a few.
See you at the fire pit.
Yeah.
All right, thank you guys so much. This was a great talk today, and I look forward to seeing you guys on campus.
Thank you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlton. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Gary.
All right, thank you all for coming today. If you can please move to